All right, let's go ahead and get started here. So, welcome everyone to our workshop on church administration. So, I am not necessarily the most comfortable at the public speaking, so I have a lot of notes here. Ignore a little bit of my reading from the papers as best as you can. But we're hoping to take some of the tediousness and frustration that go along with church administration and probably going to build stress and anxiety on top of that for you as well as we go through all these topics. I think that like any good presentation that has slides, there's always a catchphrase. And so when thinking of administration, I thought that probably the best catchphrase I could have is try to be super cool, not super annoying about it. We are going obviously a little bit with a comic book theme here in our presentation this afternoon. But then as I got to thinking about this and about being super cool, not super annoying, it seemed a little bit bossy. So I added a sub tagline that says, unless you want to be. It's not really for me to judge. If you want to be that kind of a person that does choose to use the ability that you can write policies and procedures for others and make them as difficult as possible, I guess that's on you. However, then I also thought people may know that you're here. So one last subline is, if you are choosing to be obnoxious about administration, don't tell anyone you came to this workshop. So I know that sometimes people around here also think that I'm constantly trying to come up with too many rules or overcomplicate things by seeing legal risks everywhere. And I really don't think that's true. But I did write this disclaimer. So we do not claim to be legal advisors, HR professionals, compliance consultants, counselors, or professionals of any kind or any capacity. I wanted to have permission slips from your senior pastors in order for you to be here. However, Adam wouldn't let me.
So, as we already started discussing, like you asked, what is administration? I'll ask the question is, why are you here? Like, why did you choose to come to this particular workshop? And we can go ahead and get some answers. This is really
you guys got to participate.
Interactive conversation. This is not we're up here talking to you guys. This is, there's so much with administration that it has to be a Q&A almost type conversation.
It's okay. Come
on. This is Montana, by the way. Everyone say hi to Montana. Montana's going to CBI, in January? So, doing good things. But yeah, so why did you guys choose to come to this particular workshop and not another workshop? That's a good question. That's a good answer. I like that.
There you go. Yes.
Our church is a very small plant, and our pastor's got a lot of the burden doing a lot of it on his own, and we just want to know what it is that he's doing and see where we can help.
Are you on full-time staff at that church?
No, our pastor's not even on full-time.
Gotcha. No, yeah. On a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate your current administrative process?
Yeah. Well, you kind of have to define what are you referring to administrative processes. That's pretty vague.
Yeah. It is, and it's a really big term as far as everything that's kind of not ministry. Like it, to some extent,
back office
connects to administration of the church organization in a lot of different ways. So it's a very open-ended question intentionally. But, overall, how would you say that, and there's no right or wrong answer. It is, I started to say it's not being recorded, but it is being recorded. So your pastor may hear this, so rate high, but...
It sounds like to me, it's, we always talk about, like, we don't want to overemphasize the practical, but if the practical doesn't happen, then the spiritual definitely can't happen, because you have to create a place and a space and systems to work within and the world we live in. And so,
correct.
In our case, like, we're a 12-year-old church plant, so we're not that far really from, we're still kind of growing into. Somebody said in the senior pastor breakout that we're kind of building the ship as we're headed out to sea. while we're on the water. And so some of these things probably should already have been taken care of, but we're figuring it out as we go and starting to institutionalize without becoming concrete.
Mm-hmm. And you'll see, as we go through this, you'll kind of see. I mean, our church is 40 years in at this point, and as you see, as we go through some of the examples, like there's still things that change, there's still things that shift and move. I mean, it's just that's how things happen. So, what do you hope to learn about in today's workshop? Sometimes it's kind of you don't know what you don't know, right? In a lot of ways.
Hear how other churches are doing things.
Yeah.
As a relatively young church plant, 4 years old, what we don't know, learning what we don't know.
Yeah.
Finding out what we're not doing.
You just kind of alluded to there's always things that are changing. There's like now security issues and things that never were on the radar before that now are. So things are changing that we go. What's the best practice?
Good.
For them.
Very good. All right. So what is our purpose here today? How are we going to approach this topic? And we really wanted to hear from you guys, kind of what was your thought process coming into the room first before we say, okay, here's how we were approaching the topic. So originally I had started to build one of those, pyramid graphics. We're going to talk about these different layers of administration. However, I was told that was really boring and that everybody does pyramid graphics. So instead, to go with the theme, every great superhero story has a great skyline oftentimes in the distance, and you see them. So we're going to build our superhero base of operations based on foundational principles of administration. Then we're going to talk about enhanced components of what that looks like and what church administration can be, and then the advanced components of that. So all of these topics and all of what we're doing aren't going to necessarily fix everything. They aren't necessarily going to solve all of the problems in these discussions. And like here is step 1 through 10, and if you do these 10 things, you will have great administration and a great operation of your church. That's not necessarily what we're going to be able to do in the time that we have together. But we can talk about some principles, some common things that we've looked at and that we have found. And I'll walk you a little bit through kind of my history and what my background has as far as what coming into this. The church world is very different than what I'm used to and what I have learned through those process. Yeah. And our hope is that as staff of the church or volunteers of the church, but that if we go through this, we'll all kind of be super-ish church employees or church administrators as we go through this. So that is truly what the goal is. So first, you might want to know who we are. So now that you know the purpose, you want to know who we are, we're going to take a few minutes and go through that. My name is Ryan. So
you need to know how to draw, by the way, if you're going to
ignore
be a church
the beard.
administration.
I shaved after I drew it on here. It was kind of one of those that seemed like a good idea until I was halfway through it, and then I realized, oh, that's a bad idea, but I just kind of have to finish now. So I did have a full beard, so ignore that. Was supposed to be me at one time. Up until last year, when I joined the staff here, I had spent the last 20 years leading in operations for a large organization. I specialized in commercial insurance. And I hope you don't mind if I can take about 3 minutes and just give you guys a little bit of my history and testimony. I think it's important for us to share a little bit about ourselves before we actually get into the topic that's here. Just know where we're coming from and how we're approaching this and what some of our background is. So I grew up in church. I had amazing parents that really lived and provided a very genuine example of the faith that they talked about often growing up. I, however, grew a little bit of a hypocritical version of a Christian is how I would describe it looking back now. I knew all the Bible stories. I knew about Jonah and Adam. I knew about Noah, Christmas, Easter. I knew all of that stuff. However, for some reason, my understanding of them as more than stories didn't necessarily take root. I spent many years in a cycle of trying to be good enough and then failing in some way to be good enough and then becoming discouraged, and then becoming enthralled with the attention of the world. I really chased people, like an attention and whatever it could be, in chasing wealth and success and trying to make myself feel better about the world that I was in, knowing it was wrong, and then starting the cycle all over again. If I could just be better, if I could just be good enough, it would kind of get rid of what I was feeling in that way. My failures were many. There was loneliness, there was guilt, and the life and my picture of what life wasn't what I thought it was supposed to be. One day I literally woke up, both spiritually and literally, out of the blue, ready to start the cycle all over again. I just knew something was wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so there I was, not where I was supposed to be. And I remember getting in my office on my hands and knees and just praying. And it wasn't one of those, I've been caught in a sin or I have consequences that I'm dealing with type of prayers, which is what I was normally used to. It was, I just need to figure out what's true and what's real and what's going on. And I believe it was from a place of true sorrow. It was one of those where the weight was just so immense, I can't necessarily even describe it. I opened my Bible and I looked for a story to help. Like I said, I knew the stories. I knew all the stories. But instead, what I discovered was I needed to understand the gospel, not the stories. I needed to understand how it was not about me being good enough, because I would never be good enough. It wasn't about how much I tried. It didn't matter that I spent my whole life trying to be a good person to horrifically fail from time and time again. What I needed to understand was grace and faith in Jesus' sacrifice. I needed to learn the terms of grace, sanctification, justification, all these things I had heard but not understood. And I needed to really understand how that could impact my life. At that juncture in my life, I had secured what most probably people in the world would describe as a successful career. I had influence, finances, to use a business term. I had a lot of upward momentum in my career path. So we're going to fast forward now a little bit in my life, because I don't want to bore you with a bunch of details. I have a whole bunch of kids. I'm married. I have a great life with that. But I got a call one day from someone who I hadn't seen in decades. It sounded like they were going through a tough time, and I invited them to go to lunch. This young man didn't have a ride home after lunch, and I offered to take him. He told me how he was staying with friends, and when I got there, I realized how truly blessed I had been. There was, I believe, 3 or 4 guys living in a trailer, and some others perhaps in the wooded area behind where he was staying. He shared stories, and I heard about the drug problems that were going on in the area. There were children running around in gravel with who knows whatever else was there, without shoes, without anything. And I prefer to keep the details private. I will just say my wife and I did what we could, but it seemed so much bigger than us. And we couldn't figure out how to help. And we got a call for help with food. We got to know more than just that guy in the area. We got to know more about the other people. So I came in and I spoke to the pastor here. And we were relatively new to the church at the time, and asking, what do you guys do for the community? What do you have going on? And again, I'll skip a whole bunch of boring details, and I will just say that conversation led to, we started up a mobile food pantry for people and did that for a while. And then after that, I started leading our community missions teams that we had here. And then something unexpected happened. So my employer went through a restructuring, and I found myself with a choice. The church here had expressed an interest in me trying to help with their operations and their finances, or I could dive into the business world a lot further into what I was already in. And I just couldn't get past the thought and the feeling that I was supposed to help with something here, and I was supposed to do something. And so about 8 months ago, I would say it was 8 or 9 months ago, I made the decision that, sure, I can invest in here and see what I can do to try to help from an administration standpoint, from an operational standpoint. And I do want to say that so you know exactly the types of personalities that you're dealing with. I kind of feel, and I've learned in the corporate world, that when it comes to a sense of adventure or a risk of appetite, there's kind of a scale, and everybody falls into one side of the scale or another. So I think this probably best describes where I fall on that scale. In order to reduce liability, my suggestion is wrap everything in bubble wrap. Like, at all costs, we can protect it. This is Adam. He's also on this scale. This is probably where he falls at, somewhere along those words.
And there's really no joke. I had an idea of having a drifting ministry, like a car drifting ministry, and I knew what Ryan was already going to say about that car drifting ministry. So yeah, bubble wrap everything.
That's right. Bubble wrap it. So you want to introduce yourself?
So my name's Adam Shabilsky. I'm an assistant pastor here on staff. Kind of like Ryan, I think that it was God's timing when we got here. Me and my wife got here about 4 years ago to St. Joe. We came from just outside of Atlanta. I grew up in Calvary Chapels. I grew up in Greg Laurie. I grew up at Greg Laurie's church in Harvest in California. And then most of you probably know Sandy Adams as well. I actually met my wife at his church when we were 14. I was in construction and then the military for a while. I was medically retired from the military. And so just like Ryan, my background wasn't necessarily like, as I went to church, my background wasn't necessarily like I wasn't in the ministry full time all the time. And so I had a calling in my life when I was about my early 20s, when I was still at Sandy Adams Church, to be full-time ministry. But like God's timing, it's not always right then and there. So fast forward 20 years later, when Josh was coming out here, I've known Josh for about 20 years now. And when he was moving out here, he asked if I wanted to move out here. And I just got in the military. And I said, no, I'm getting my family settled and I don't know anything about Missouri. And so long story short, God prompted us to move out here, and we did. And I started serving as an elder here at the church. And then when I was doing construction down in KC, and when the time came, kind of restructuring a little bit, like we said about being flexible, right? When the time came, and Josh said, hey, I think it's time for you, if you want to come full time. I said, okay, sounds good. And so that's what I did. It's been about 18 months, 20 months now, almost 2 years since I've been full time here at the church. And as we continue to go through this, talking about, like Brian was talking about the building and having, the foundation and having the framing of the building and having the top of it is, I kind of looked at that as us coming on, because about half our staff at this point, just so you guys know, about half our staff is kind of newer within 4 years of the church, and the church has been here for 40 years. We have a couple people who have been on staff now for about 25 years. But there's a lot of new staff here, to say the least. So as you'll see as we go through this, the reason why we can kind of speak to this is because, one, we've come from the corporate world a little bit to say, we're kind of outsiders and going, hey, the foundation's kind of broken here. Let's fix that, right? Not necessarily it was broken and completely wrong, but it needed to be shifted a little bit. Things need to be fixed. Cracks need to be fixed, to get us moving in the right direction again. And so that's kind of where I come from, is, like I said, from the construction background, military, but then coming full-time ministry, kind of like Ryan, in the same way.
So another group question here, trying to get you guys to all participate in the discussion and get more comfortable with it. Our next one, what are aspects? I heard someone say, financials, project management. Like, what are other things that you think of our administration? Like, now is your time to call those things out. What do you think of? First things on top of your head. Paperwork, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I dislike paperwork.
Those legal aspects.
Legal, yep. Bills? Oh, yes. They gave me a whole stack of checks to sign yesterday. That was fun. I understand that. Managing people, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Answering the phone.
Yep. Front office type of functions. Scheduling. Yep.
Team organizing.
Yep. Structure. Yeah. Security. Yep. You guys are hitting about 75% of the things that we have that we're going to hit. We're not going to get all of the topics that you guys bring up, but it kind of lets us know if we were on the right track and how we were trying to build this out. And I will say you'll see a lot of the things that you just mentioned that are on our discussion topics.
So, like we talked about Ryan brought three sections to this that we came up with, one being the foundation of administration policies. And just like a building, like I brought up earlier, when I came on, I definitely saw some cracks in the foundation that as I was talking to Pastor Josh about, I felt like, God was pulling back things within our ministry to be able to solidify those foundational cracks and then to be able to build off of that. And so just like a regular building, you got to have a solid foundation before you can put any of the framework up, right? And so some of the things to keep in mind as we're going through this is when you're talking about the foundation, having to do everything in order. So make sure everything is done is proper. Just like we serve a God that is a God of order, making sure that that foundation and the administration, things are done within order. Being servants, right? Like, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but you brought up the back office, being able to serve, kind of like the way I look at it is you got a back office and a front office, right? Like construction, you got your back office who pays the bills, who takes care of all the paperwork, the legal stuff, and the front. When it came to construction, I was more on the front office side where I was doing all the management of the projects and making sure things were done proper, right? So having that servanthood is serving the back office serving so that the front office can kind of do what they need to do. Unfortunately, you have to do both. Accountability, right? Because we're accountable to our bosses, we're accountable to the people of the church. So making sure that we're doing everything in order and accountable, and then flexibility. While yes, we try to do everything we feel God calling us to do, but being flexible within that as well. So keeping those things in mind as we go through this, to have that nice solid foundation. So the first thing in the foundation that me and Ryan came up with is measuring what matters. So like I said, when it comes to grace, we have a lot of ministries that are out there. Michael's a part of our ministry. He's been here for quite some time. And he can tell you, no joke, we probably have 20 plus ministries. I mean, we have 20 plus just in probably Hands of Grace that we do. It means we're running in a lot of different places, doing a lot of different things at one time. When we're going through this, and as we were kind of brainstorming, what do we want our church to look like? What do we want to be known for in the community? I felt like we had to scale things back and go, okay, well, what matters, right? What matters when you're setting up a church, or you're trying to get back to that solid foundation of a church? And so we had to kind of go, okay, well, what's the mission of the church, right? To love others, to reach the lost, and to make disciples. So the ministry focus is, of course, teaching the Word of God, worship, discipleship, fellowship, evangelism, and service. And so keeping those in mind as we go through this, that those are the things that matter as we go through the policies, as we go through procedures, as we go through financials, is keeping those things in mind, that these are the things that matter no matter what we're doing ministry-wise in the community, that these are the core aspects of the church of what we're supposed to be doing, right? So.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Core aspect real quick.
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this and praying about this, thinking about the core aspects of the church, of what the church is there to do, right, is to love others, to reach the lost, and to make disciples. And to do that, right, we teach God's word, worship type ministries, discipleship, fellowship, evangelism, and service. So again, keeping these things in mind as we go on to what these other aspects of administration.
So the other foundational principle is financial. So we talked about that a little bit. You guys threw out things like balancing or writing checks, paying the bills, those things associated with that. But it's a little bit more when you're talking about from an administrative standpoint for financials. I have 5 categories of things that I would like to recommend that everybody kind of look into, and my thoughts on them that I think make a really good, robust financial program for what you have here. However, first, so I can get to know you guys a little bit better here too. Who here hates balancing a checkbook? Raise your hand.
Who does that anymore even?
I know. Well, you got to...
Honestly.
Okay, so you can raise your hand on the next one. Who here says, I know up here how much I have in my account still?
Oh, no, not me.
I don't need to write it down. Who holds their breath when they hit the tap to pay? I think that what's funny is, to some extent, a few years ago, I probably would have raised my hand on all of those things. When my wife and I got married, we went on our honeymoon, and on the way back, I remember I was convinced, and I was one of those, I keep it all up here. I keep a running tally. I know where it is. I don't need to write anything down. And we drove to Colorado and had the trip. When we were on our way back home, driving back home, and went to get gas. As we entered back into town, and my debit card was declined. And she's like, why? And I'm like, I have no idea. This is how much money is still in there. And so she paid for the gas because at that point we still had separate accounts. However, when we got back home, we need to figure out what happened to the money. And apparently I just was off a little bit in my math and how much we had spent on the trip. So I had to very quickly learn that I guess keeping it all up here wasn't going to work as well as I thought it would. And I think that principle is definitely applied into what we're doing here. So the first component and category that I would have is donations and giving. Making sure that you have meticulous giving records so that you can produce appropriate giving statements. And then making sure you have policies associated with directed donations. Do you accept directed donations? Do you not accept directed donations? Are you able to track directed donations if you accept them? And do you understand what directed donations are? So if someone says, I'm giving you money and this is for missions, you must spend that on missions. You can't put it into your general account. And oftentimes people may take directed donations for a couple of things, but there's also times people will just write it in like whatever they want on their check. And, a recommendation is look into, do you accept those or do you don't accept directed donations? It's at the discretion of the ministry. And so look into those types of things to determine whether or not and what your plan is for doing those, and how you will handle the scenarios when you do accept them to make sure you track them and spend them appropriately and with complete transparency. Expense and budget management. Do you have a budget? Do you track and manage against your budget? Who has the authority to go outside of your budget? And who authorizes those expenses? Do you have some kind of process for that? Making sure that you're managing expenses, actively managing, is really important, and that you do have a budget that you are looking at and that you can present. A lot of these principles are because transparency and stewardship are very important when it comes to church financials. And just being able to always show where you're at, what you've done, and why you've done it at all times is so important. The next one, reimbursements. So third financial principle that I would recommend. Do you know what an accountable reimbursement plan is versus a non-accountable plan? And do you know the rules that there are around that? Like if you have staff or employees, do you do mileage reimbursement? Do you know how to figure that? It's important to understand how you're doing reimbursements and how you're recording them and keeping your documentation appropriate for that as well.
So can I ask real quick?
Of course.
So what is accountable, and I'm sorry to just explain it.
No, I didn't.
You've got to tell like a 5. What's accountable versus not accountable?
So I'll give you my really short definition for that. And most of these, because we have such a short amount of time, I will always encourage you, go out and look at it and research it, like write down the terms. And there are IRS guidelines for those, but it has to do with, do people have to give you receipts for reimbursements? And if they're an employee that you're reimbursing, whether or not it is tax deductible or non-taxed or taxed on the reimbursement is based on how you record the reimbursement when it comes in and the documentation that you keep. So accountable means that there's components to it that you have it so that it can be non-taxed. If you don't have those documents, then it's a tax reimbursement. And yep.
Thank
Try
you.
not to sidetrack us too much, but are you using a software like QuickBooks or something for this tracking? Or are you guys doing like pen and paper?
Well, so we do have a very robust financial software system that we have for things. However, this is something like reimbursements and stuff. It is part of just the bookkeeping, accounting portion of it as well. The system's not going to know unless you tell it. So,
and keep in mind, each church is going to be a little different,
Yes.
right, with your financial situation and where you guys are at in the sense of, can we afford a software program, or, are we going to go pen and paper still? So part of this is, like I say, we're giving general knowledge, general advice, general wisdom as far as where we've gone, or there's some stuff though that are like Ryan's saying, where this is, you have to keep track of this. And each state also, you got to remember, each state's a little different too. So knowing what your state is and the laws of your state are very crucial.
I'm giving you topics to look into because everybody, there are different. I like that you bring up the different states. Things are different. There's general IRS components. They're all out there on the IRS. So I'm not going to be giving IRS advice or tax advice in this room. I am not a tax accountant, and I do not pretend to be. But I will say that there are, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Sometimes it's just knowing the right questions to start searching for so that you can find the answers. The answers are out there if you just know what's to be searching for. So, and the last one that I have on here is financial protections. It's, do you have clear controls and separation of duties to protect against misuse or even the question of misuse of funds? I think it's really important that having multiple people at key stages in a process as a financial control is important. If you cannot have the same person that is counting the money and having access to the bank and the books all in there, it just adds an extra layer of protection and that there's transparency and all of those things. So really think about your financial controls that you have and make sure that you have those in place. Yep. So I think you got the next one.
So as you can tell, Ryan's a lot more detailed in exactly what's going on. He takes care of the books, the finances, HR, where I'm more day-to-day with the personnel of people and stuff like that. So policies is a big one because it's, as anyone knows, policies are kind of like that. It's the law behind what the church is going by, right? It's how are we going to conduct our church? What are we putting in place so that way when a situation comes up, we can handle that situation. We've already thought about it. We're not trying to think about it at last minute. This is something we've, gone over with, a pastor, the elders, people hopefully wiser than us, that we can say, hey, what situations have you been through that we can, adhere to as well. One of those are, the governance of the church, right? The bylaws and stuff like that. That's a crucial one. And these are all things, that it's good to review. When me and Ryan came on, these are policies, procedures, even the bylaws. We went through the bylaws when we came on to make sure that, is this still, not as our church adhering to it, but does it still fit our church model? For instance, I know Calvary Chapel's a big one where you get the head pastor, then you got the elders, and the elders kind of help the pastor, with the decision making and everything that his idea that God's leading him to does. One of the ones that we went to when we first got here, it was mostly a elder run church with deacons and elders that were kind of making the decisions. When Josh came on, it kind of went to that Calvary Chapel model where it was the head pastor making decisions with the elders backing it. We saw another church that we kind of, Josh liked the executive model of it, where it was, you had the executive pastor, which is with us is Josh Blevins, some assistant pastors, and then I call them subject matter experts, like Ryan's one of them. And then we have another HR type person that's involved as well. So we call that our executive team. Our executive team is what helps run the day-to-day church. So we don't have to wait that 1 month or 1 day a month to get with the elders to go, hey, can we do this or can we do that? Now we have weekly meetings to where, okay, we're making decisions based off of what the executive team says, and the levels that we've given the executive team, and moving forward with that. So, and then we have that within our bylaws as well, where as we were going through, Ryan kind of noticed like these bylaws are really strict. So the initial bylaws that were made were almost kind of keeping our hands tied in a way. And so as we went through the bylaws, we kind of loosened them up a little bit to where the executive team had more able to make decisions instead of it being so stringent by the bylaws and the elders and that kind of stuff. So what I'm getting at is it's good to go through your guys' policies and to go through your just everything that governs the church, to go through it every once in a while and make sure that it's still within your mission focus of what the church is doing. Okay. So again, the policies are like I said, we won't have procedures yet, but the policies are more like the law aspect of the church, whereas the procedures are more like how does that play out, right? So we will get to that here in a little bit.
So do you have written policies regarding different areas of church administration?
Correct. So thank you for bringing it up. Some of the policies that we had, I'll give you an example. When the church was first started, even when I came on, one of the policies was that they were allowing chairs and tables to be taken from the church, and not to say rented, but borrowed. And so people would borrow tables and chairs outside the church, like say they had a yard sale. They would ask if they could borrow 2 or 3 tables. They would utilize them, bring them back. As we became more event-focused church, we said, we need to look at this policy again. We looked at the policy, sat down, said, does this really make sense? And it didn't make sense for the church anymore. So we changed that policy where we said, you know what? We can't let anybody just borrow tables and chairs anymore. So if you rent the building out, which is one of our policies, we allow people to rent the building. I think at no cost, is more just a cleaning cost. But the policy is they can rent the building, a classroom, a room for an event, and then they can borrow the tables and chairs during that event. And so, yeah, we do have again, it's one of those things where we try to hit policies prior to it being an issue. That way we're not thinking of it like at that second, but we're thinking with a level head of like, okay, what would we want to do in this situation? One of the other things when we talk about, looking at policies and changing policies, when we look at policies, we want to make sure that the policies are not just good for the church leadership, but the church staff, right? Make sure the policies are good for the day-to-day workings, but then also, which we kind of been running into lately, is also the congregation. The congregation can be used to a lot of policies that are out there. And as you make changes to those, how does it affect your congregation? A lot of people get hurt. I'll be honest with you. I got called to Gestapo at one point because we were making changes. One of them was security. We started locking the doors to all the classrooms during church when the exterior doors were open. Said, hey, we got to lock these classrooms up because we don't know who's going to come into these classrooms, and we want to keep our congregation safe. Not everybody liked that. Another one was locking the kitchen up. A lot of people did not, especially the older generation that have been here for years, didn't like the fact that we were locking the kitchen up during Sunday morning service. As a leadership, we understand though the safeties that come with that. We've had people come from the Love's gas station down the street. They've walked all the way from there, walked into our building, and just harassed a couple people at one point. So we have to look out, one, what's best for, the leadership, the staff, but then also the congregation as well. And then how do you explain those policies to the congregation, in the best way possible? So.
Hey, just to clarify, the reason for locking the kitchen, I'm assuming, is because of what's in there?
Yeah, I mean, you got knives, you have...
I just literally had this thought the other day, so I'm just like, yeah, that's actually a really good idea.
And I mean, again, you don't know who's coming into the church necessarily. And so with that, we had, I know it sounds weird, but coffee, a bunch of coffee go missing, a bunch of cups. We're trying to be as I don't say frugal, but honoring to God's money, because it's not ours. It's not, stewardship. We're trying to be good stewards of what God's given us. And so we try to express that to our congregation as well. Like, we're not doing this to hurt anybody. We're not doing this to make it frustrating. Anybody can come ask us for a key. For the most part, we'll say, hey, what do you need out of here? Okay, yeah, we got you. And again, we're always looking at those policies to see what's going to be best. So.
And actually, that's a great question as for what it is, because our next topic is safety. So when you're thinking about foundational aspects, we talked about, Adam talked about what matters first from a ministry standpoint, of financials, and then now having policies. And the way I would describe policies, it's the what, with procedures being the how. So when we talk about procedures in a minute, I'll go through some examples, but policies are what do we do, or what is our stance on certain things and our approach, and the procedures is how we do it. From a safety standpoint, like that's the kitchen is a perfect example. We need to make sure that it's not security, it's safety, and that we'll talk a little bit about security too, but it's regarding ensuring the safety of the church and its people at the foundational level. What are we doing to make sure that we are doing that? And I came up with 3 things that I think are really important to consider when you're thinking about the safety of your church at this kind of a level. And the first is family safety and the people, the congregants. Things like, do you have a good background check policy? For your vulnerable areas, have you thought about your nursery, your kids, your youth, your groups with disabilities, all of those areas? And what does that look like? What is your screening process that you have? Do you know what your mandated reporting obligations are as a church and as an organization from a safety standpoint? Does your staff know? Do your volunteers know? Do they know what to be looking for? And when we're protecting the people that are in our care, how are you doing that and how are you approaching that? And the second topic I would say is governance. From a safety standpoint, do you have the governance, the leadership structure, and the oversight for protecting those ministry aspects? Like, do you have a clear, documented, Adam mentioned things like your articles of incorporation and your bylaws and all of those things that tell you how you're going to run and who's doing what. Do you have them? Do they match what you're doing? Are you following them? That's all important. That is a safety measure. And then the last one is insurance. So again, I come from a background there, but are you properly protected for liability, for property? I've often said that insurance for a church is probably the most difficult thing in exposure to manage. So another group participation process here, but when you think of insurance for a restaurant, what kind of risks or insurance components do you think they're looking out for? Fire. What else for a restaurant? Food safety, foodborne illnesses. What else? Slips and falls. Now think of a retail store. What type of things are they going to be looking for? Theft. Yeah, loss. Liabilities. Let's see here. Lost my place. I'm sure they have staff like work comp. Constant stream of people going in and out, and there's a risk that comes along with that. Yep. Yeah. Parking lot facilities, like making sure that you have them there. Like daycare, childcare facilities. What type of risks or exposures do they have?
Abuse and molestation.
Okay.
I have a background in insurance.
Yeah. Now, when you think of a church, all those same exposures apply. It's not just one, but you have all of these very different components that you need to make sure that you have the proper protections for. Yeah, D&O policies, yes. You also, as a church, have the potential that every year when VBS rolls around, you have a whole bunch of guys with table saws that show up. And then they decide that they're going to build scaffolding and do a circus theme and put trapeze from the ceiling using Home Depot ropes and super glue and bag clips. Not that anybody would do that, but
the security team that they're carrying, and they use a weapon. I assume there's a policy for that too.
There is a policy for just about everything. But what I will just say is it's really important not to underestimate having at least the right minimum policies that you have or policies that are good for a church and for what you have. When I think about safety standpoint, making sure that we're keeping families and kids safe, making sure that you are operating by the right governance and structure, and then making sure that you have insurance for the liabilities and exposures you have from a safety standpoint is just really important. Those were the three that I really wanted to stress, be thinking through when you think about, again, we're talking about foundational. So this is just stuff that all churches really need to make sure that they understand and that they have a good background with.
And again, it's all different levels too, right? Again, church size will determine what your foundation looks like.
I'm going to mention the next one too. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but talking about legal administration. This to me...
Do we have insurance for that?
Yeah.
You talking about legal?
Well, hey, I had disclaimers at the beginning. I am not a lawyer. I'm not an attorney. No, but really when you think about it, it's a difficult topic to navigate with the church. For one, I came from an industry where I'm looking at risks all the time, and I naturally try to mitigate every one of those risks. That's what I do. And with churches, understanding the legal requirements can be sometimes tricky. And I tried my best to understand and research as much as I could with that. And I think that the best way I could come up with to try to get people to think about things from a legal perspective, or just to ask the questions. None of us here, I assume, have any kind of a legal backing. However, we can always think in some of those terms too to say, is there a legal question I should ask about this? So I have two scenarios, and I'm going to read them to you, and I'm going to ask you guys if you think they're true or false. I will also, disclaimer number 2 in my presentation that I am just going to have is that I did not do much research into these. It's kind of what came up in my Google search that's there, and I just took out the names and the distinguishing facts that are in there so you couldn't figure out who it really was, if there are any that are true. But I think that it really hopefully will get you to think about how are we approaching and thinking through sometimes when we make decisions. So the first scenario is a religious organization was sued for a tithe refund due to the individual feeling that the funds were used for something other than what was publicly stated the funds would be used for. Do you think that's true or false?
True.
It is true. And in the case that I looked at, the courts did side with the organization. However, there was an investigation to look at and determine if the church's public statements matched its financial practices. So if you say you're going to do something, you need to do it. And that's really, I would say, the lesson learned from that one is. The next one, an abuse victim from more than 50 years ago sued a long-standing church that has seen multiple pastors and governing boards as they've been around for over 100 years since the incident occurred. True or false? So this one's actually false. However, I brought this one up because while this specific scenario wasn't necessarily true, multiple states have changed some of their legal reporting time limits. And with that, it makes it even more important that we're keeping good records for how long we need to keep them, and that we have good documentation, and that we have good protection policies in place, and that we just have all of those things in order. Because as in some cases, potentially they can go back who knows how far and ask you for what information you have or what you should be able to communicate on. So if you don't retain the things that you need to retain, it can cause issues for you down the road. I will say, I'm trying to go pretty quickly here so we don't run out of time, but compliance is also a part of legal obligations as well. Knowing what you have to file, when you need to file it, and really even why you're filing it is important. States are different. I can't advise anybody on what they need to do. I don't know what all states you're from, but I will say research is your best friend. If you're doing something new, a good thorough internet search can be your best friend to determine if you're required to do something. An example that I would have is we were looking at doing something with someone from another state, and so before we've initiated, I did a whole bunch of searches and to determine what were the rules about did I need to send anything to that state, or did I need to do anything in order to be compliant with what we were doing across that state line. So just research all of that beforehand so that you can make sure you're following all of those.
Can you put that back up, if you don't mind? So we're done with the foundational aspect of things. I would say, again, that each church should be doing some kind of version of this if you guys aren't doing at least something. And it might not be that you have to have a legal team telling you where you're doing well or you're not. There's resources out there. For instance, we have a company that takes care of our check writing, that takes care of and they also help us with legal advice. And so there's companies where you might not have to have a legal person on standby, but there's companies out there that are willing, for maybe a small charge or, free advice. Like our insurance company also helps us with, I think it was background checks and how we should do them. Or it was security. They have a whole breakdown of security and, what they cover, don't cover, how churches should do it, what things they should stay away from. So there's plenty of resources to where you guys can be doing something out here, one of these things to keep you guys safe, honestly. So
the foundation's complete. So before we go to the next part, does anybody have any questions about those topics? Nope. Okay.
And again, those are the things, the core, not saying that nothing else is important, of course, of church. It's just things that we have to have, kind of things in today's day and age where we have to have something like that to be able to do ministry, to be able to love on people, to be able to serve people. You know what I mean? But it's just the world we live in today.
So let's talk about enhancing our administration. So we built our foundation. Now, these other things are what we build on top of what we just discussed, and to try to get some more in there. So procedures. We talked a bit about the policies, which are the what. The procedures are how we do what we're going to do. So, for example, you may have a child protection policy that says, we will be doing these things, these certain things. And in that child protection policy, you have a procedure on background checks and how you're going to run background checks and how you're going to do interviews and screenings. You have procedures on your digital communication policies between kids and volunteers or staff. You may have your 2-adult rule that, there's 2 adults in all interactions with kids. Those are all your kind of procedures and how you're maintaining your policy for your child protection policy. One way to think of policies and procedures, typically your policies don't change that often. Your procedures may change fairly often. So how you're doing it may change. You may go to a different way that you're doing the background checks, and they may be administered a different way, or there may be changes in some of those step-by-step guides that you have in those procedures, but your policy still is intact. It's absolutely that we will run background checks every time, and we will have interviews, and we will always have these different things in place. So when thinking about procedures, I would also recommend, and I didn't want to spend too much time here because I think most everybody understands the concepts of procedures, and every church is going to have very unique. They're one of those things, I think, that if we all pull our policy and procedures that we have in place, we may find similarities, but we are all doing it 10 different ways in how we get to kind of the same type of general feel. But there are a few that I was going to recommend that if you don't have, or if you're not sure if they've been updated or looked at in a while, that you might want to. One, if you have staff, do you have a PTO policy? Do you actually know how people are going to take time off and how that's going to be done? A work comp reporting policy. States have requirements and how work comp should be reported and what has to happen with it, and making sure that people have access to the policy to know how it will work and what's there. It's not an optional one. Facility and equipment usage. It may seem really minor, but do you have a church van? Do you loan it out? Do you not loan it out? Do you have a procedure to say how you do that fairly if you do?
Policy we just went over not too long ago.
Yeah, that's why I had it on here. An emergency response policy, fire, tornado, all the normal things, but also like a missing child. If you have a very big facility, somebody can't find their kid, what do you do? And do you have a medical emergency policy? If somebody has a medical emergency, do people know what to do in that situation? Or does everyone just stop and look at each other like, what do we do now? Activity agreement and participation policy. Do you know when you have to have those permission slips? Do you know what you're telling parents or what you're telling people about what their kids are going to be doing? And do you have their buy-in? And a records retention policy. I talked a minute ago about it's important to retain documents, the right documents, but it's really important to have a record retention policy to know when you shouldn't hold on to things. You sometimes can hold on to things too long, and then when you should get rid of things, and then also making sure you have the stuff that you always need to have, just in case you're ever asked for it and what's there. So I think a records retention policy is also an important aspect. Okay, Adam.
So structure, I know we went over a little bit as far as policy and the governing board and stuff like that. But the other thing to keep in mind is the structure of who's doing what, right? And so why it's important to have that structure. Some of the questions you might ask is who reports to whom and why? Who makes the final decision, right? What are the roles of each person? How and what do we communicate to staff and to the congregation? Although, again, I always go back to the size of the church because sometimes there's one person, sometimes there's 15 staff, sometimes there's 50 staff. The reason we ask these questions is because clarity, the structure of the church, clarity is very important, right? Everyone knows their role and responsibility. We don't want things to fall on people just because somebody raised their hand and said, oh, I got that. When I got here, some of that stuff was happening. There'd be a task that came up. Everyone sat there and goes, who's going to take this? And then finally somebody said, you know what? I got it. You don't want that. You don't want people to get frustrated because somebody's willing to take on, because there's always going to be one or two people that are willing to raise their hand and say, I got this. So clarity of roles, accountability, decisions are traceable and not just chaotic. So who made that decision? Why did they make it? Right? Having that accountability, the stewardship of time, money, and people managed wisely. Is that structure scalable, right? As a church, we don't necessarily try to grow like a business, but if you're teaching the Word of God, hopefully that church grows, right? Hopefully the community, people are getting saved and your church is growing. Well, is that structure even scalable? Is that even possible? Like if you get more people and you're doing more ministries, do we have the people to minister to them? Or are we just running everybody ragged? So scalability and then biblical integrity, making sure that structure mirrors what the Bible talks about and is not just, well, yeah, this looks good. to the world standard, but is it actually biblical as well? Okay. So the structure, again, talking about, I think we brought this up at one point, scheduling and planning, document policy management, who's doing, basically who's doing these tasks, resource management. I'm kind of going through quick on this because I know it's 4:08 and we're supposed to get out here at 4:15. So if you guys have questions, please stop me, stop us and ask questions. Leadership and oversight in the structure. One of the things we need to remember is that, like, overall, the whole staff, no matter what position you're in, is that we're all supportive to each other, whether you're the lead pastor or, you're a secretary answering the phone. We're all in ministry together, and so we all need to be supporting each other no matter what role you're in, right? Anything else you can think of before we move on?
Only other thing I would say on structure is it's also important to have accurate job descriptions if you have staff.
Yeah.
Like that's something I wouldn't underestimate either, but people know what's expected of them. I feel better when I know what people are expecting of me, so I'm sure that goes with all the people that we work with as well.
Yep.
This next one, I jokingly said a little at the very beginning that if people find church or the topic of administration like tedious and frustrating, that I was possibly going to add stress and anxiety onto that. And I think it's probably because when you think about, okay, you got the legal components and compliance, and you've got, structure, and we're talking about policies and procedures and all of these things, that can feel really, really heavy, especially if it's one person trying to shoulder all of that. Like, it can feel like a lot. So I wanted to talk about, like, support. What does that look like for the people that are trying to do this work? And three suggestions that I have coming into this that I have found really helpful as I think through it. So most basic from a support standpoint for people who are doing this work is get really, really good at internet research. Oftentimes you can find the root source for what you need to have through the internet most of the time. And I use the search 3 times rule for myself. I'll ask the same question in 3 different ways, and by the time I get the different answers from there, I probably have a pretty good idea on how it is. So, like, as an example, if completely fake scenario, but say a church was going to put in a donut shop out in the parking lot, and it's open 6 days a week that's out there. So one of your question is that would that be UBI for a church? Would that be unrelated business income for a church to have that's there? So you could search for what is UBI for a church, what is unrelated business income, and you'd be able to better understand what that is. And then you could say, give me an example of a church is UBI, and start getting those and finding the scenarios that you could probably find online. And then you could search and say, how do I know if money received by a church is for UBI? And you could get a completely different set of responses, but it gives you enough that you can start to see, oh, here's where the IRS documents are that say what those guidelines are. Here's also what other churches or people have created articles so that I can better understand it. And I think just really getting good at thinking what are the questions I should be asking about some of these things can be really helpful. So then I would say your next one, taking the same topic, but is phone a friend, build a network of peers. We're one body of brothers and sisters, and hopefully this week you're taking advantage of meeting people and building a network of peers that you can find comfortable to say, I was thinking about opening up a donut shop on the parking lot for 6 days a week. You know anything that I should be thinking about from that? Is there anything that I should be concerned with? And maybe they can give you advice and be like, oh, we did that and it was horrible. And this is all the things that went wrong. Or perhaps what they should be doing is telling you what your third piece or suggestion is for expert support is you should probably contact your accountant or attorney to make sure that you have all the right aspects in there. Contact a professional when you need it. Like if you're unsure, finding information on the internet and then talking to people who are doing and creating a good network of peers, and then finding the right professionals, having a good accountant or an attorney that knows church law and some of those things that you can have when you have some of those topics is really important, and to make sure that you have that. All right, I try to go through that really quick.
So data and physical security, a lot of ways are similar and different. Data security protects sensitive information, financials, pastoral care, volunteer child records. And so having a way of doing that, for instance, we have a server here, we have a company, outside company, third-party company that takes care of a lot of our security. And so we rely on a third party. We don't have anybody in-house to take care of that, again, third party. Physical security, again, help, make sure that the staff, the congregates, and having